What Ron asked me to talk about is irrigation, but specifically what happens in the spring irrigation, because, a lot of people, hopefully not us, will just set their irrigation system on their lawn or their landscape or even their garden sometimes and just irrigate it the same way all year long. So basically turn it on for an hour every day or an hour every other day or an hour every day, whatever suits their fancy when they set those little irrigation timers up. And, that's mostly wrong. I mean, just think about it. The chances of you being correct are 1 in 100, I mean, you're not going to get it right by just guessing, because there's certain things that go into irrigation and irrigation scheduling, meaning how much water should I put on? How frequently should I put that water on? And those things are determined by soil texture, the amount of sand, silt, and clay, the amount of organic matter. So basically the water holding capacity of the soil. And it's also determined by the crop root depth, how deep the roots can go to mine that soil out of that. And evapotranspiration plays a role. And then also how much water can you use out of the soil profile before the plant really starts suffering. And so we're going to talk about spring irrigation practices and focus on them, because in the spring, a lot of times people are watering way too frequently or too much. And right now, because of the rain and the snow that we've had, we wouldn't be needing to irrigate at all. So we'll cover things like maturity and crop root depth, because that's really important in the spring. Because ask yourself, how deep are the roots in an immature crop? Well, they could be just a quarter of an inch to an inch down. And so you're really only needing to fill up that first inch or inch and a half of soil before the extra moisture you're putting on is just dropping out through the bottom, and you're wasting it and probably dragging important fertilizers with it, which is an important concept. In the spring is when we put out our fertilizers, and in the spring is when a lot of people over irrigate and just leach that fertility right down below the root zone, so the roots never have a chance to catch up. It's a little bit of a waste of money, but it also leaches nitrates into the groundwater. We'll talk just a little bit about the math, kind of superficially, and then we'll summarize what we kind of talked about. So basically, springtime irrigation in our gardens is crucial to gardening success, especially here in the Intermountain West. We live in a desert. So if you've moved here from the east, you're going to realize that we talk a lot about irrigation, which basically is the same thing as what you had when it rained. So we have to make our own rain, right? So like I mentioned, initially these garden crops are immature and have shallow root depth. So when you're planting your radishes at first, or your carrots, you just need to irrigate that top layer of soil. But remember, that top layer of soil is going to dry out frequently, okay? And so you'll need to irrigate quite frequently, way different than during the summer when the crops are mature. And so light, infrequent irrigations are recommended in early spring to get things germinated but remember, lots of times you can plant right into the moisture. So last week I planted my alfalfa test plots and also my small grains test plots, my wheat and my barley. And we haven't even irrigated them yet, because we planted them, especially the wheat and the barley, down an inch down right into the moisture. So they're sitting there in that moist soil, and we're just going to let them germinate and pop through the soil before we really start irrigating them heavily. Because if you really start, if you irrigate these things before they've germinated, lots of times the water can do two things. Number one, it can be so much that it erodes the bare ground and takes your seed with it, or it covers the seed with soil moving around from other places, and then the seeds don't have enough energy to get through that extra soil. And also, worst case scenario is the impact of those water droplets can cause a little bit of soil crusting, especially if soils have a little bit of sodium in them, or if they are heavy clay, low organic matter soils. That increased splashing action of the water droplets that you put on there can actually be a detriment and not helpful at all. So there's a lot of situations where we just go ahead, plant to moisture, let it come up, and then do our first irrigation then. And even that irrigation would be very, very light, and we'd have to do it very, very frequently, every other day, lots of times. Same with if you're planting a new sward of grass out there. You've got a new home and you're planting seed, light infrequent irrigations. I did want to mention a couple of rules of thumb, general ideas. They don't work in every situation, but they do tend to work. My first rule of thumb is use the 60D penny nail method. And so just get the biggest penny nail you can get, and just use that to drive down in the soil. And if it drives down really easily and it's kind of wet down there and wet pretty deep for that nail, then it's not time to irrigate. Even if the soil is dry at the surface, it's not time to irrigate. However, later on, if you poke it in and it gets harder and harder to get in, and you can only get it in the top inch or so, then you're getting close. You need to probably start irrigating. And even sometimes when it stops going in 4 inches, you need to prepare for irrigation in certain situations. So that's just my idea on that 60 penny nail method. It's better than just guessing. It's not the best. It doesn't work in all situations. And it's way better than just looking at the garden saying, oh, it's dry, it's time to irrigate, or it's wet, I don't need to irrigate. Because you could have had later on in the season, not at the springtime, but during the summer, you could have had a heavy rainfall, but it didn't go down more than maybe a 1/16 to a quarter of an inch. You would still need to irrigate that week. So that nail method helps with that. The feel method is what I'm going to kind of show some pictures of tonight, some video. And that's where you go down and usually use a soil probe to get down in the bottom third of the crop root zone. So once again, later on in the season, as the crops mature and the roots go down further, you're going to have to take the soil sample deeper and deeper in the soil. And that's just a matter of kind of learning about your crop. If you don't know, hey, gardening's all about learning, and you may need to pull up a few plants to see what the roots look like and how deep they are. I'm not against that because you're learning. Whatever you learn by pulling up a plant is going to help you be a better gardener later on in your life. And hey, I think sacrificing a few plants for education and is perfect. So you might just need to pull up a few plants to see what the crop zone is like. That's what they do in the potato fields, believe it or not, in some respects. So then you'll take that soil moisture, and remember, in the spring you'll be taking it from fairly close to the soil surface because the roots are at the surface. Later on, you'll get it from deeper and deeper in the soil profile. But what you'll do is the first thing, you'll create a ball in your hand, and then you'll see how well that ball forms. Of course, if it forms a nice, good ball, and you've got a loam soil, it's got sand, silt, and clay in it, then that means it's got pretty good moisture. And if you drop it on the hood of your truck or something, or on the cement, and it doesn't break, that means you've got pretty good soil moisture. It's not time to irrigate. The other thing you can do is you can rub a ribbon through your finger. You put your finger like the trigger of a gun, and then rub a ribbon out of that ball. And the length of the ribbon determines how much moisture is in the soil. The more ribbon, the more moisture is in the soil. Or make snakes, or make mud pies, whatever you did in the 4th grade or when you were younger to determine soil moisture. Do that. Take you back to your younger days when you really knew something about dirt, right? Let's take a look at this soil moisture feel method, and then I'll show you some videos on it. Let's say you've got a loam soil. That would be that column right down the middle. And that starts where there's 0 to 25% moisture deficit, meaning that's pretty wet at the top of the chart there. And then as you go down through, you're getting more and more moisture deficit. And once you get down to 50% moisture deficit, a lot of crops need to be irrigated at that stage. Now, of course, that soil can dry down to 75% moisture deficit, and even down to 80 to 90% moisture deficit, but your crops will, be suffering long before you get to those moisture regimes. So the moisture regime that I've got circled there is when you're in between that 25 to 50% moisture deficit, because a lot of your crops will start experiencing problems with osmosis and problems with nutrient uptake, problems with translocation, problems with plant turgor right there between 25 and 50% soil moisture stress, meaning you've used up about 50% of half of your moisture, in your soil. So taking a look at that loam soil there, when it's wet, you can form a weak ball that will hold its shape. And then when you drop it, that ball will stay and hold its shape. But if you drop it and it cracks apart, you're getting really, really close to the time that you need to start getting ready to irrigate. And then when you can't form a ball, or, and it doesn't really get together and you can't form a ball, you need to irrigate that day. If you wait any longer, you'll get more moisture stress. Okay. Take a look over there at the clay loam. The clay loam, when it's wet, it'll ball up and it'll also slick, meaning you can push it between your fingers. Okay. And then as you get towards the time when you really want to start irrigating those, it won't slick through your fingers. When you rub it, a little piece of the clay in between your fingers, the clay loam in between your fingers, it won't slick. It'll kind of grind to a halt. Okay. Anyhow, that's just one chart there that you can use. I'll probably send that to Lena so that she could send that out to everybody. But if you were a master gardener, it's in, I used it in my master gardener lectures also. Okay. So let's take a look at some video real quick here. Soil moisture by feel. The first one I'm going to talk about is the clay loam, which is fairly common. I would say around here, our loam soils, our clay loam soils, and then our sandy loams are the most common types of soils that we've got. So I'm going to show you a couple of examples of soils. This is soil moisture by feel for the clay loam. And hopefully I can show the video here. This is when it's very, very wet. So 0 to 25% moisture deficit, meaning it's wet. There was sound with this video, but apparently not.
You probably didn't share your sound when you shared your screen, Reed.
Yeah, well, the sound isn't that important. That shows you how I can slick that. You see how that slicks between my thumb and finger? And then I think I try to form a ribbon, but it's really difficult to form a ribbon. Let's go down to the next one here. This will be at 0. Oh, we're still at the 0.
I was just going to say, I think it's important to note that when he talks about this deficit, we're talking about field capacity, not saturation. So field capacity means that the excess water has drained out. There's oxygen in there. And the saturation is when you're just totally full of water. And so 0 to 25% soil moisture deficit is field capacity. 0% is right at field capacity, not at saturation.
Thanks, Ron. Yeah, just like with a sponge, fill up a sponge with water, set it on the counter, it'll drip. Once it starts dripping, you're at capacity with that sponge. Soil's the same way. It has a water holding capacity. Well, you can think about water holding capacity kind of like Huggies and the cheap Smith brand. And you can say to yourself, if I want to get out of church early with my kids, with my grandkids, which diapers do I choose? Does anybody know? If I want to get out of church early and my grandkids are sitting on my lap,
I would say cloth with the plastic pants on them.
My wife just says, you better use the Huggies because you're staying at church. Well, and remember, so Huggies, they always have the same water holding capacity. Cheap Smith brand or the ones that we grew up with, Ron, the water holding capacity isn't very much, but it's always the same, from Huggies to Huggies and from cheap brand to cheap brand. Same with your soil. Which one holds the most moisture? A clay soil or a sandy soil? Well, a clay soil, because it's got more water holding capacity. You can think of that as the Huggies diapers, whereas the sand is more like the cheap Smith's brand, right? Okay, now here's what this soil is going to look like. Remember, you dug down and you got some soil moisture at the bottom third of the crop root depth. And so you're not taking soil from the surface. And so when you pull that soil out, it could have any of these moisture regimes, any of these. It could be wet, it could be dry. I don't know what it is. You pull it out and you put it in your hand and you look at it. Say that this is maybe a week later and we've had evapotranspiration at 1/4 of an inch per day, or maybe 4 days later, and we've lost an inch of moisture per day. Now we're going to take a look at this soil and see what it does. So this is approaching the halfway mark when it's used up half of its moisture. This is what it's going to look like. See if you can see a difference. Remember, this is clay loam. It's not slicking very good. In fact, instead of slicking, you form ribbons. And then you take a look at the length of that ribbon and see that those ribbons are 1/2 inch long or so to 1 inch long, almost, maybe even 1 inch long. But you see little flakes are coming off, right? That wouldn't happen if you were, closer to field capacity. Okay, let's go to the next slide. This is 25. Oh, you got to go to the next slide. This is, you've got, if your soil looks like this, if you got a clay loam and it looks like this, you've got to irrigate it that day, or you might be just a little bit past the time when you should have irrigated. Look at it, way different, right? it doesn't form a ball very good. And the ball doesn't hold together. See, if you've waited that long, you may be experiencing some yield loss. No ribbon can form. Okay. Now we're going to go to 75 to 100%. And so this is, you'll never get to this point. If you get to this point, your plants are dead. So this is just for kicks and just for educational purposes, what it would look like if your plants were dead. I think that's enough of that. Okay. Let's say that now we're going to go to another garden, somebody else's garden, and this one's a sandy loam, which is also common. And we're going to dig down and we're going to see what the moisture is like. And let's say we dig down and the moisture, it's kind of wet, but how wet is it? Well, this is what it would look like, a sandy loam, when it's pretty wet, when it's as wet as it can get. Forms a nice ball. Ball sticks together for the most part. You really don't form ribbons with sandy loams because there's so much sand in them that it doesn't have much to stick together. But you can form a ball with them. Okay. And now we'll go to right here. This is when you're getting approaching the time for irrigation. See, the ball flakes off and doesn't hold together. That's a good indicator on a sandy loam. I don't know if you guys could hear my voice because my video kind of shakes when I'm doing another video, but you guys heard what I said is that, you know, that ball, you could see when it stopped forming the ball and when it was breaking apart, that's when you should get ready to irrigate. And then right here is where it may be, it's time to irrigate or just a little bit past time to irrigate. Remember, this is a sandy loam. Okay. Any questions on that? Comments? Confusion? Let's talk about some rules of thumb for lawns. So first of all, you've got the stepping method, which I use. You know, you walk across your lawn, okay, in the middle of the day. You walk across there and you wait 15 minutes and then you look back. And if you can still see if you can look back and there's no footprints in the grass, meaning all of the, I might have written this wrong. No visible footprint, no irrigation. Yeah, when the grass springs back and you can't see your footprints, you don't need to irrigate for the most part. Remember, this is a rule of thumb, but it's better than just totally guessing. Now, if you go out there and walk across your lawn and you can see your footprints for many, many minutes, 15 to 20 to 30 minutes after you've been on your lawn, then you need to irrigate that. Or it's getting closer to irrigate because the grass doesn't have any turgor pressure and it's not springing back. Now, another way to look at this too, let me go page up. Another way to look at lawns is that, hey, you know, I had a lawn out there at a little cabin at Chesterfield, and we always had Chesterfield days in the spring. And people always asked me how I kept that lawn looking so good. And the reason why that lawn looked so good is because I didn't do anything with it all year long. I never irrigated it. I just mowed it, you know, every once in a while. And it became very, very tough. It became inured to drought and things like that. So it would harden itself off pretty quickly. Now, you know, if I had company or, you know, I knew that there was going to be a group that wanted to, you know, go visit the cabin there, I would irrigate it a week or two before, and it would green right up, you know. And that's true of lawns. Now, I don't know if I would recommend that necessarily in your neighborhood. I know I've got a few neighbors that use this method, actually. Their lawns don't have any insects or disease. They're a little bit brown in the summer. But remember, grass will go dormant and it'll come right back in the fall. So, you know, you don't have to be irrigating your lawn all the time if you can put up with a little bit of brown grass a little bit. Remember, if you do let it go brown, it certainly will do a number on reducing the disease and insect pressures. Okay, Ron, so we're at 7:26. Do I have time to go through a couple of mathematics really quick?
Yeah, my clock says 7:23, so let's go 7-8 minutes will be fine.
Okay, I'll do some maths. The water holding capacity. Let's take a look at a loam here. A loam will hold about 2 inches of moisture per foot of soil, meaning that if you put a rain gauge out there, turn your irrigation system on, and wait until that rain gauge has 2 inches in the rain gauge, that moisture will have penetrated down into the top foot of soil. If you put 4 inches on, it'll go down to the top 2 feet of soil. Okay, so that's kind of the way. That's just kind of a rule of thumb. Sand, however, it only holds about 1 inch per foot of soil. Just something to keep in mind there. Crop root depths, you can see onions 1 foot, alfalfa 4, orchards 6 feet. But a lot of the times our plants in our gardens and our lawns, you know, we can look at around about 2 feet of crop root depth. Lawns maybe more like a foot, but potatoes, beans, and things a foot. Corn maybe down to 3 feet. Like I said, that's going to differ. And in the spring, everything gets irrigated a lot more frequently because the depth is a lot more shallow. Okay. And remember, I said you've got evapotranspiration, and in April right now, we may be only using 1/10 of an inch per day. We haven't even gotten to that yet in April. I don't think April even got to using 1/10 of an inch. We were getting inches per day. So we've got a lot of moisture out there in our soil right now. But in May, if it warms up, we might get close to 2/10 of an inch, something like that. And on some weeks, it might even be 1/4 of an inch per day. This little chart just shows you that different crops at different maturities have to be irrigated more or less frequently, meaning they start stressing out at different moisture regimes. We'll just use you and say that you can use up half of the water in your garden for most crops before you have to re-irrigate. Realizing that onions, you have to irrigate after you've used up only 40% of the moisture. Okay, so the math. Okay, available moisture is the crop root depth multiplied by the water holding capacity. So let's say we've got beans, right? Crop root depth 2 feet. And let's say that we've got a loam, which holds about 2 inches of moisture per foot of soil. Well, that's easy to calculate. We know that we've got 4 inches of moisture to work with. We know that if you put on 4 inches of moisture, you're definitely got that whole 2 feet saturated. Okay. So let's say we start at the beginning of the year with a saturated soil. Okay. And we want to know how much of that moisture we can use. How many inches can we use? Well, with beans, you can use about half of that moisture, so you'll divide that 4 inches by 2, meaning that you can use up 2 of those inches that are available in the 2 feet. But once you start using more than that, your crop will start stressing. And of course, you can use up all 4 inches, but your plants will be dead, right? So keep that in your mind. You can't wait until your crop's dead before you irrigate it. You have to irrigate it when you've used up half the moisture, which in this case would be half of the complete 4 inches. Okay. So this 2 inches of the water that can be used prior to crop experiencing moisture stress. We're going to talk about that as useful water, the water we can use. So how long between an irrigation cycle based on evapotranspiration? Well, it's 8 days, because if you can only use up those 2 inches and you're using 1/4 of an inch per day, that means in 4 days you'll used up an inch, and in the next 4 days you'll used up that second inch. That's 8 days. Now remember, it's going to be a lot more frequent than that in the spring, because your crop root depth is not going to be anywhere near 2 feet. It might be 2 inches, and you'll have to plug those numbers in. But the one thing that's important to realize at this point is that that's really all the calculations you need to do. I mean, you can calculate it every day and figure out how many days till the next irrigation, how much water should I put on right now to bring it back up to full. But that's not right, because you need to, not only can you not go past using up half of the moisture, you need to use up half of that moisture, because your soil needs to be aerated, your roots need air, and also you need to reduce the disease pressure and the insect pressure. And you do that by bringing the soil down to the crop moisture stress point, and then back up to full, and then back down to the crop moisture stress point, back and forth and back and forth. Not keeping it wet all the time at the top, or letting it go dry past using half of the available moisture. Okay. So one of the things you can do is you can how long should you run your sprinkler? Well, how long does it take you to put on 2 inches of water? Well, that's the inches of water divided by the application rate. And let's say that our rain gauge says that we're putting on about 8/10 of an inch of water per hour. And the way you calculate that is you put a rain gauge out there, turn your irrigation system on for an hour, and then find out how many inches are in that rain gauge. So that means that in this situation, for our example, you'd be leaving this sprinkler system on for 2.5 hours, which is probably not really realistic. Usually those are putting on more than 8/10 of an inch. I just use this for an example. Okay. So I'm going to skip that. That's just other things. Common mistakes: frequent light watering promotes shallow root development. resulting in plants that are more susceptible to drought and just a problem. Always keep in mind, remember, my garden and my lawn over there in Chesterfield, it's a strong and disease free garden over there. Overwatering greatly diminishes oxygen for plant roots. So you get poor plant development, poor fruit development. Excessive watering leaches nutrients, and not irrigating, even when plants show signs of water stress, can quickly damage plants during hot weather. So be prepared. You go from 50% moisture to 75% moisture deficit really, really quick. So have your irrigation ready to go at that time. So irrigation is one of the most critical management actions for successful gardening. I think it's as important as anything else we do. Variety selection is important, disease management, weed management, all those things tie back into irrigation management. And lots of times we just leave that up to guesswork. We just, turn the irrigation system on the same all year long, and then we wonder why we've got problems, right? Okay. With a little investigation, taking some soil out at different root depths and a little bit of math, irrigation is a cinch. So anyhow, any questions on that? I'm going to stop sharing so I can see y'all. Did everybody like the flowery slide presentation that I put together? I really put some effort into that background for everybody. If you didn't like what I said, you should at least like the background. Okay, any questions? Ron, I'm going to turn it back to you to whatever we want to do here.
Okay, so any questions on irrigation? Just keep in mind that as that one of those last slides said, if you irrigate frequently and shallow, especially in the springtime, you'll never train those roots to grow deep. So don't water too often. You don't want them to, especially when they're germinating, you don't want them to dry out. But once you get them, but you don't want it to be too wet either, soaking wet. I mean, they might germinate, but they still got to have oxygen for germination to take place. So don't get them too wet, and allow those young plants to start reaching for the moisture. Don't let them. I mean, you'll get evaporation off from the ground. So it's not just the plants that are taking moisture out of the ground. So if we have sunny days and windy days and things like that, it's not just moisture from the roots from the plants. It's also we're going to be taking moisture from the wind. So keep in mind that root depth, you can kind of judge the root depth by the height of the plant. That'll help you, but keep that moisture adequate, just not too wet. Yeah, really good. Thanks, Reed. Appreciate that. Oh, and also I want to include something about organic matter. You talk about the water holding capacity. When we talk about water holding capacity in our soils classes, we're talking about the water holding capacity of the mineral component of the soil. So if we have no organic matter in our soil, that's how much water the soil will hold. For every 1% of organic matter you add to the soil, you actually increase your water holding capacity by quite a bit. At 1%, you'll increase by about 20,000 gallons per acre, which comes out to almost an inch of water in 6 inches. So keep that in mind too. Do what you can to try to get your organic matter up, and that'll really help with your soil. When you notice that soil that Reed was holding in the videos, there wasn't a whole lot of organic matter in that soil. So organic matter is really the silver bullet for our soils. Organic matter and living plants, growing roots, and things like that.